Today we have a fascinating things hidden discussion planned for you. I'm your host, David Gornoski, and I'm here with psychologist Scott Garrels. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thank you, David.
Now, you're the author of a book that I really enjoy. It's called Mimesis and Science, which is a look at empirical research on imitation and the mimetic theory of culture and religions. You edited this book. You kind of brought together a lot of different folks from various disciplines, and that's my favorite thing is to see
Yeah.
interdisciplinary and dialogue going on, particularly in the realm of mimetic theory. So, um, first, maybe give us a little background on your career and your vocation, what you've been doing, and then we can talk about how you got involved with making this book.
Sure. Yeah. I'm a clinical psychologist in Pasadena, California, and got my doctorate at Fuller Theological Seminary, which is here in Pasadena, which is how I landed here. After practicing in private practice for 10 or so years, I went on and also went back to school in a way and got my doctorate in psychoanalysis. So I still continue to practice. That's my full-time job is private practice and here in Pasadena.
And then how did you come across the work of Rene Girard and mimetic theory?
Yeah, so when I was at Fuller studying psychology, it was my second year at Fuller, and 9/11 happened, and I was in my own therapy at the time with an analyst, and of course that was a major earth sort of rattling event that I began to talk more and more and think more and more about the relationship between violence and religion. I was studying the program I was in at Fuller. You study both clinical psychology and theology at the same time. And I was learning about, going back to the Hebrew Bible and trying to make sense of how sacrifice actually works. Like, how is that a God would demand violence to create peace? At the same time, 9/11 happened. And it just so happened my therapist, I was talking to him about all these concerns I had, what's going on in the world and how does it connect to the Bible. And he recommended sort of offhandedly Gil Bailey's book, Violence Unveiled. And so it turned out that book was kind of my gateway into the Girardian world. That's how I got interested in Girard. That's how I got kind of connected to Girard, was through my therapist while I was in graduate school.
So he had advised that you look into this as a means of understanding the world.
Yeah. Yes. Little did I know at the time, he didn't tell me right away. He was actually writing his own dissertation, becoming an analyst on Girard. So he very casually, didn't tell me that he was doing his own research, but very casually suggested Girard's work based on what I was interested in.
So let me guess, you grasped for it, and it made him want to grasp for the Girardian work more.
There is more to the story there. Yeah, we actually ended up helping each other as a intellectually. The things I discovered through the sciences, he wasn't aware of, and of course I wasn't at the time aware of Girard. So we kind of both introduced each other to something that ended up creating a more fuller picture for both of us.
That's an example of positive mimesis in which you didn't have rivalry over the subject knowledge of I discovered him first and I know what to do with it better than you do.
Yes.
Right.
I'm actually I was thinking about that recently, greatly indebted to that therapist. He wrote his dissertation and he saw where I was going, and he sort of just didn't, he probably could have continued to write and put himself out there, but didn't need to, and let me do it. And to this day, you probably won't find his name published with anything, even though he was such a big part of this project. So he was a very positive model of good mimesis, the mentor not trying to keep the mentee down or threatened by that progress. So, yeah.
And that's, of course, the model we see all throughout the New Testament, with Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, always creating a positive mimetic role model that takes the smaller posture so
Mhm.
as to not invite scandal and conflict
Yeah,
over ideas or lifestyle or anything, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, makes a big difference.
Now you said you had some knowledge of the sciences. What were the sciences that you were talking about that came to play with your understanding of mimetic theory?
Yeah, so when I was introduced to Girard that year after 9/11, I did a lot of reading of his theory and of course made a big impression on my thinking, helped answer a lot of questions, but also, or helped frame a lot of questions I had, but also made me ask a lot more questions. And at the time, I was doing my doctoral research in the neurosciences. I was studying, looking at the cognitive, psychosocial profile or deficits of individuals who are born without a corpus callosum. The main, it's a interhemispheric fissure that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And some individuals are born without that interhemispheric connection. It's called agenesis of the corpus callosum. So in studying in this neuropsych lab, one day my advisor came in and presented to all of us this article on mirror neurons, which had come out just I think the article had recently come out. The discovery maybe had been made a few years before. But reading that article made me realize, or made me wonder what, because the whole mirror neuron, of course, discovery has become known as, a sort of neural substrate, or this basic mechanism for imitation, self-other kind of a link between perception and action. So reading that article made me wonder what else in the sciences, neurosciences, developmental psychology, what are they saying about human imitation? Because it's not something that I had ever studied, and imitation was never a subject that came up in undergraduate school, even graduate school, except for the early sort of Piagetian, child imitation. So that made me really want to do my own, searching to find out how big of a topic is imitation, given Girard's theory is basing so much on that. And that's when I came across at that time, was this sort of grand renaissance across the sciences, sort of rediscovering imitation as this foundational, overlooked or forgotten, however you want to say that, mechanism of human behavior, cognition. Uh, so then once I discovered that, then I realized, oh wow, the Girardians don't seem aware of all of this, from what I could tell, all of this scientific work being done on imitation. And that's when I decided to link the two.
And so that was a big. I remember even Rene Girard was commenting on that. So I mean, you were kind of the guy that was facilitating that dialogue between the disciplines. Then that even Girard was excited about. Right? I remember in some of his later works, he was talking about, wow, mirror neurons. They were talking about that in some of the new books or some of the later works that he put out.
Yeah, I actually don't know how excited Girard was about it.
Oh yeah,
I think he certainly saw it as a positive development. What I mean, I was certainly excited to discover both, to connect the dots between these two fields, and that's what the most enjoyable thing for me, even as a therapist, is sort of connecting the dots between things that don't seem related, or parts of ourselves that sort of we don't know how to reconcile them. But so what I've found is that some of the Girardians, and maybe I'm jumping ahead, they were, I think, a little skeptical about something proving the mimetic theory. And I now come to see what they mean by it. And Jean-Pierre Dupuy, in his chapter in the edited book, frames it in terms of seeing these different disciplines, not one proving the other, but acting together in harmony, like a symphony. They really augment each other and create a more robust picture, not necessarily one proving the other. So I think in that sense, Girard was excited. Yeah.
How let's unpack that a little bit. How does the symphonic approach to these different fields contrast with these fields to possibly proving one or the other? You know, like what does that mean? Just the bar is
Yeah.
lower there about what you're.
Yeah. So you're gonna get me to think here. I think for the Girardians, this is my understanding, and I haven't recently read all these chapters, so it's not fresh in my mind. But in the introduction, I've learned to go back and and read about how imitation was recognized, early with with Plato and Aristotle as something foundational to human behavior. Aristotle has the famous quote, something to the effect of, man is above all the other animals in its capacity for imitation, which begins at birth.
Mm-hmm.
So that, so thousands of years ago, imitation was already recognized as something, as a powerful operating force from birth. For the Girardians, they didn't, if you get into Andrew Meltzoff's work, where he was the first sort of researcher to show neonatal imitation right from birth, where the famous pictures of him sticking his tongue out at an infant and the infant sticking its tongue out back at him. And so often he was the first face that infant ever saw. So that's science saying, here's science sort of showing us, here's imitation from birth, as if it's a big discovery. And the Girardians are saying, we don't need that to know that imitation happens from birth. We've already known that through observation thousands of years ago. That's already been written about. So there was this sort of correction about, and this is where Girard, his theory developed out of reading literary works, right? Those aren't scientists proving how human behavior operates. It's them very intuitively, through their genius, are articulating it and showing us these things are real. So the Girardians are saying, we don't need science to tell us imitation is happening from birth and there's this powerful mechanism. We don't need it to prove our theory. What it does is it maybe more, it augments and fills in gaps of our understanding, becomes more of a, I guess the example was, you can have a song played with just an acoustic guitar, but then you can have it played with the full orchestra, and it's an even more powerful, moving sort of experience, I guess you could say. So that's kind of how that analogy.
The idea is that one discipline doesn't have to be the determiner for the legitimacy of another field of thought, right?
Yeah, you said it much more concisely.
So that would see, that's where I think is interesting too, is because I mentioned to you before we started this program that one of the things we do on our program, we have an assortment of different kind of spin-off shows within the body of the work that we do, and one of them is, we call it Science and You, and my co-host is a physicist named Dr. Yu, and he has a kind of theory that I think deserves further investigation, which is why I consult with him on the program for years now to engage with different anomalies that I think his theory explains better than the current standard model of physics. And every physicist will tell you, theoretical physicists will tell you, most of them, that we have a problem with the standard physics foundations that we have. Quantum, they still haven't found a way to reconcile, quantum with relativity, and there's a lot of problems with these different attempts to do so. And what I like about his theory, it's very elegant. It's very confounding to the wise, so to speak, because it's something that I've seen him explain to elementary kids, and they can understand it. in every aspect of the different forces he believes are manifestations of magnetism, magnetic force. He
Hmm.
believes that the atom is a dipolar little magnet that has both positive and negative poles, and that everything we think about um, in the world of physics can be simplified with this model of rather there because you get into an interesting thing where when you have the discovery of the different charges in electricity, there's this assumption that well eventually there's going to be a singular charged particle for each. So if there's positive negative, then there's a particle that's positive and there's a
Hmm.
particle that's negative. And I think it's interesting. That's a kind of a Western mind framework where you automatically presume two different poles or two different charges require two distinct particles,
Hmm.
where everything's compartmentalized and chopping and cutting and separation.
Hmm.
Versus someone who's been influenced by Eastern mindset to some degree would be able to approach things in a more holistic approach, saying, well, if there's two charges, they could be two poles of the same particle, just
Hmm.
rearranged in different ways structurally to create different net charges for
Hmm.
different molecules and so forth. You see that in chemistry where that fits better. But of course, I'm not asking you to address the physics claims of Dr. Yu, but I do think it's interesting from a harmonious orchestral perspective, the
Yeah.
idea of what has been mapped out somewhat with the neuroscience technologies looking at brain imaging that you point to in your book,
Yeah.
and some of the claims being made by Dr. Yu independently, that there could be, again, this doesn't mean that this becomes the final foundation, but there could be a physics explanation for some of the phenomena of desire, of how we feel attracted almost like a magnet towards some people in the room. Somebody
Yeah.
walks in the room and people, and oftentimes, if everybody else is attracted to them and fixated on, oh, wow, this is a special person, we feel that same swept up feeling. It could
Yeah.
even be someone that we don't like. It could be a politician we don't like. But if you're in a room with everybody's excited and energy about them,
Yeah.
even though you might have severe cognitive dissonance, where you say, I don't like that person, but you'll feel that kind of flight of feeling like, oh, wow, what's going on? This is special.
The
Yeah.
collective whole. Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting how different people develop, you know, to to create that or to avoid that. But yeah, and how that those individuals throughout their lives find out what works, and we're all sort of experimenting, as humans, to find out how to create that desire, or sometimes how to avoid the attention as well.
Yeah.
That's But
You talk a
yeah.
little bit about animal mimesis, right? And I look at the like I remember walking by a pond with ducks, and I would watch. It was actually this wasn't a duck. This was a water bird, and they would come and they were doing this kind of very symmetrical, interplay, and I don't know if they were battling or mating or what, but they all kind of go hand in hand. It looks very symmetrical. They were mirroring each other's movements in the water, positioning themselves. And I said,
Yeah.
this looks just like a little magnet. It looks like little magnets when you pull them around and they kind of rearrange. And I thought, there's something we're now finding out that human beings, for example, have magnetoreceptors that we don't fully understand the full implications of. That they've done experiments where they show human beings being dropped in a kind of disoriented space, and they statistically have a higher point of finding true north without knowing where they're at than they do avoid, not finding it. Um, and I think
Yeah.
that's interesting, with the
Yeah.
some of the work you've cataloged in this book.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, as a therapist, I have I am not well read in physics, but to your point, I think an interdisciplinary approach is probably the best approach to try to grapple with some of these big issues about who we are and why we're here, and because I don't assume I can never really know what's going on in somebody's mind, but I can assume that we're a part of a universe that includes things like black holes that we orbit around. And so even something like a black hole, however that operates, fascinates me to understand human behavior, just this whole process of death and rebirth,
Mhm.
and how the laws of physics somehow are not comprehensible to our mind, what's happening there at that event horizon, how that death and rebirth happens, at these centers of the universe. In the same way that we don't fully understand how that kind of operation, I assume, because we we exist in that reality, is happening somewhere in our minds, you know, in our ways in which we need to go through a similar events that feel like death, that feel like they're going to kill us or destroy us, but actually by going through them, we come out the other end sort of reborn, and there's all sorts of versions of that. But yeah, so physics is fascinating. I wish I knew a lot more about it, and I think that there's a lot there to offer psychology, and I'm sure there's a lot who have integrated the two. I'm
I'll
just
show
not.
you this report this was published in uh, last month, February 25th of 2023 by Carly Casella. It says, this is in sciencealert.com. It says, all living cells could have the molecular machinery for a sixth sense. Every animal on Earth may house the molecular machinery to sense magnetic fields, even those organisms that don't navigate or migrate using this mysterious sixth sense. Now, this is important because that's what typically they've kind of concluded. Well, only certain animals like fish or birds and things that have migratory patterns that are pretty extraordinarily seen are going to have a magnetic sense. But this story says scientists working on fruit flies have now identified a ubiquitous molecule in all living cells that can respond to magnetic sensitivity if it is present in high enough amounts or if other molecules assist it. The new findings suggest that magnetoreception could be much more common in the animal kingdom than we ever knew. If researchers are right, it might be an astonishingly ancient trait shared by virtually all living things, albeit with differing strengths. That doesn't mean all animals or plants can actively sense and follow magnetic fields, but it does suggest that all living cells might, including ours. And how we see the external world from vision, hearing, through touch, taste, and smell as well are well understood. A neuroscientist, Richard Baines, said, but by contrast, which animals can sense and how they respond to a magnetic field remains unknown. This
Mm.
study has made significant advances in understanding how animals sense and respond to external magnetic fields, which is a disputed field. So it's active. And I don't want to take up too much time, but that corresponds with what you say. Kind of, I mean, you didn't say that, but it
Yeah.
fits with some of this right up from the beginning in
Yeah.
your book, about brain imaging. And you talk about on page 25, you talk about another prominent line of research using brain imaging technology has looked at the relationship between imitation, empathic resonance, and self other differentiation. Uh, Research has demonstrated that similar brain regions are activated when one is simply imagining the same action from either perspective, observing or participating, providing further information on the neural substrates of imitation and empathic resonance. And this is the key thing: using both fMRI and positron emission tomography, the imaging studies have been used to identify specific brain regions that are thought to be involved in shared representational states, as well as differentiating between self and other with respect to imitating or being imitated. So they're measuring it by looking at magnetic fields in the brain.
Yeah, and that's the fMRI technology that allows us to see what parts of the brain are active when we're trying to isolate which parts of the brain are most active related to certain behaviors or thoughts we're engaged in. Yeah, I mean that all that just makes me just hearing you read that. I'm always amazed at how intimately even you and I, our conversation, even though it's over Zoom, intimately intertwined our minds are without knowing it. I don't know if you've seen the phenomenon when people are in a kind of heated discussion and you can see the person who's listening almost mouthing the
Yeah.
words the speaker is doing. It's as if what's offline is sort of leaking out online because they're so right there attuned. And
And you'll see that with parents when they're watching their kids perform a play. They're watching the lines and you'll see them reciting it a lot,
yeah,
quietly mouthing the words in the audience because they're remembering that
yeah,
experience and they're sharing. It might be a little bit different, but it's similar kind of effect.
yeah. And those are positive examples, and the negative ones are how we can not be hurt physically at all, but witness violence and be traumatized by that. Just seeing somebody else undergo physical harm.
Or those stories of lifelong people who've been married for 50, 60 years, and then one of them passes and the other passes very quickly on afterwards because they've shared so much mimetic or magnetic or spiritual. All those are different layers symphonically of the same
Yeah,
kind of thing that's happening, I think.
yeah. And I think what you're saying about the magnetic research or information just goes to what we are learning more and more, just how integrated we are in everything that's happening everywhere. I'm not trying to reference the recent Oscar winning movie, which I haven't seen, but just in terms of like the butterfly effect, the butterfly flaps its wings somewhere and it's related to a hurricane somewhere else. So, and what you were saying about I don't know if this is related, and I don't know the source, but studies they are doing on people responding to things happening around a corner that's out of their visual field,
Mm-hmm.
because they are somehow picking up on and it might be related to the magnetic charges, the changes in objects that are out of view. There's evidence to show they're responding to those objects even though they're not in their visual field. I think
Yeah.
that points to what you're
Yeah.
saying, which is
There's
interesting.
also interesting work done. We can go all over the place here, but it's fun just to cherry pick fun things that come to mind. Like there's work done by scientists chronicling near death experiences, right? And
Mhm.
there's several different phenomena that people experience at the point of near death. One skier is falling down a cliff, and they said everything slowed down in time. They could see every little detail. They had time to think about very expansive
Yeah,
reflections on their life, and they're like, this is kind of beyond
yeah,
what we would consider, an experience of normal reality, right? Because it's like this expanded sense of time within this life crisis moment.
and that's related to the conversion experience that the novelistic conversion experience that Girard would talk about at the climax of these great novels, where sometimes the person is on their deathbed and they suddenly re-see their whole life in this different perspective, and in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, that's fascinating that you connected to that because that's yeah, that's a that you're bringing because usually I've always thought of that from just kind of like an intellectual conversion that one is a great author is writing a book and then just has a kind of an epiphany, which I'm sure happens, but that's interesting how you connected it to like a real life crisis moment, which even Gerard had, right? Gerard had a moment where he had a health scare, as it's told, and that kind of shook,
Mhm.
challenged him. He felt like God had intervened in a special way, which gave him an increase in faith to, expand a lot of his work as it applied to, his work, understanding the Christian revelation part, which,
Yeah.
he,
Yeah, I mean, you're making me think how, there's mimesis or imitation gives rise to all these creative, beneficial things, right? Language, our social abilities, our creativity, but also what Gerard is saying is it also gives rise to sort of, I guess you could call it perversions, where we want and need far more than we could ever use or benefit from, and so it can take us away from what's actually necessary and important. So when I hear something like that, somebody have a health scare, it's interesting how it can dispel all of the bad mimesis, all the things we thought were important and actually aren't essential and aren't the thing that's actually life-giving to us. Those health scares can have that effect.
which in some ways can look like the feeling that happens when one has a scapegoat, right? Because when you have something terrifying confronts you like that, like a tumor or something, that becomes kind of like a scapegoat in some ways, to be like, okay, all my petty problems with my brother or this are all resolved now because we're all united in this
Yeah.
health journey, right? And so the figure of the disease becomes a kind of healthy scapegoat, right? Because it's not someone being harmed who's a child of God, but rather it's kind of a uniting force that binds up wounds and heals
Yeah.
squabbles for a bigger purpose, right? Which shows that there's always a good aspect of even something that seems almost
Yeah.
inherently evil, like a scapegoat mechanism, you know?
Oh yeah, researchers will definitely tell you that there's a lot of health benefits to just gossiping, sharing, talking about others, and but in both of those cases, the near death experience and the scapegoat, neither of those events which resolves a dilemma is enough to sustain us. It's just it resolves something in that moment, and
Yeah,
in both cases you have to find a way to repeat it.
right.
You have to find a way to regain or somehow get back in touch with that, both in the scapegoating sense, right, and a near death experience, which brings you back to what's important. That one time often isn't enough. You have to keep finding other new ways, and that's where our relationships play a big role in helping each other
I
encounter
bet you
that.
could speak to this maybe to help us unpack this from a psychologist standpoint, someone who works with people, that just thinking of positive scapegoating, one could say that, finding a scapegoat in, hey, you and I aren't getting along, but you know what it is? It's the economy, or, or even the crooked, rigged, big business that's made this so difficult, putting pressure on both of us. Instead of us blaming each other, let's realize we've got a bigger problem. There can be a healthy way that can help resolve tensions within a relationship. Now, going too far with that, you end up, if you seething with wrath about government or business, obviously nursing a resentment long term, even if it's not discharged on a person in an internal relationship, can be
Yeah.
unhealthy for you. But as, like you said, as a means of creating resolution, to say, hey, instead of us blaming each other, we're all both stressed out. You know why? Because we have this crooked economy, or whatever, landlords bothering us, whatever it is, can help kind of create resolution, right?
You're so right, and I don't have to look to my patients to have examples of that. I'm so acutely aware of at times when my wife and I are fighting, and it feels really hard and tense, that invariably at times one of us might mention in the heat of an argument, mention something going on in politics or something else, and it's amazing how quickly we are both back on the same side. And then, but of course, I can be aware of that, and you're right, it is helpful, so long as we can use that pause to come back a little more calmly and say, hey, I've thought about what you said and have a different, can I share more about that? So you're right, there's a real, it's not all bad, but it's the degree and to which we use it, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's to what end? If you're using it as a temporary healing mechanism, that's fine. But if both of you are united in a hatred, that can turn into a pathological bigotry or a resentment or something like that, that
Mhm.
can bother you, even though it's resolved tensions between one another. So there's always these different layers involved with this.
Yeah, if you use it to try to leave your own problem completely behind, that most likely will not work. Yeah.
From a theological standpoint, I can see how Gerard would tie that into when he suggests that even in those more horrible, overt examples of ritual human sacrifice in ancient religion, the Holy Spirit was still present within, God's image, and Holy Spirit was still present in some way that we can't understand,
Mhm.
because the scapegoat mechanism wasn't always, it's important to be clear, the scapegoat mechanism, and still is to some degree, isn't always a black and white scenario of a wrongly accused person. We take a modern reading of the word scapegoat and always load in a very Christological framework of totally innocent when we say the word scapegoat. But in
Yeah.
the Girard sense, it could be someone who is kind of guilty of something, but not a guilty socially for, bearing a certain level of guilt that
Mhm.
socially relieves the community. So
Mhm.
someone could be treated as a scapegoat, even though they did an actual crime. We prove that they did it, but lynching or killing that person becomes a scapegoating atrocity, because you're going beyond
Mhm.
just believing that they were guilty of stealing. Now you're going to, well, they're the bearer of all of our problems and that level of violation that they did, and therefore need to be treated to a certain level psychologically. It's important to realize that
Yeah.
at the same time that cuts in a negative way can cut in a positive way, where communities did not tear themselves apart when they had certain means of punishing violators of taboo. I mean, I'm thinking thousands and thousands of years. I don't know if you saw in your research, but some have suggested that in ancient primitive societies, some of the ones that didn't practice ritual cannibalism didn't survive.
Mhm.
They were extinguished because they were caught up in kind of a discordant environment for their tribal community life.
Yeah, that's one aspect of Girard's anthropology that we may never know, but it's interesting to think about that there may have been early human or pre, I don't know how you'd say it, hominid cultures that didn't rely on human sacrifice, but they became so unadaptive in comparison to the ones that did use sacrifice that we may not never know about them, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to kind of think about that, that there may have been communities that didn't rely on it, but they most certainly were overtaken, didn't survive.
I'm looking at the Heart Math Institute talking about magnetic fields, and it says heartmath.org, the science of the heart, exploring the role of the heart in human performance. And it says that um, it says the heart is the most powerful source of electromagnetic energy in the human body, producing the largest rhythmic electromagnetic field of any of the body's organs. The heart's electrical field is about 60 times greater in amplitude than the electrical activity generated by the brain. This
Mm-hmm.
field, measured in the form of ECG, can be detected anywhere on the surface of the body. And furthermore, the magnetic field produced by the heart is more than 100 times greater in strength than the field generated by the brain, and can be detected up to 3 feet away from the body in all directions using squid based magnetometers. So, when you look at that, again, this opens up a whole opportunity of thought, right? Because you think about the ancient biblical text talking about from the heart.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about people feeling a certain feeling in their heart or gut, which also has its own magnetic field. The gut, the neurons that are attached to the gut, and serotonin is linked. As you could probably explain better, to gut related issues. It's so fascinating to think. I have a gut feeling about something. My heart is aching about somebody, or I'm walking into a room and I'm just grieving in my heart, or I feel a bad feeling about this person selling me a product. There's just something that's making me feel don't
Yeah.
go there. Even though they're smiling, they've got great uh,
Yeah.
hair, everything's fine on every level. There's no, there's something off on the heart level, and that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense when you think of it that way. That
Yeah.
if there is a magnetic component to
Yeah.
mimetic desires,
Mhm.
the things that we're repelled against, that
Yeah.
that would be a component of what's happening in our relationships.
Yeah, and you're talking about things that I'm very interested in. I'm not that I'm beginning to learn about, but that have not been part of my repertoire of language or thinking that I like because it brings back in a lot of mystery to how we operate, that I think a lot of scientism and materialism and can take away, that I always would sort of, kind of poo poo or think it wasn't as valid when people talk about energies, and the chakras and things like that, which I can't really speak to because I've never participated in, but I do know what you're talking about, a very real phenomenon, but it's not part of my, I would probably say, predominantly Western, view of what's happening.
I think a lot of that has to do again with a few things. The left, Ian McGilchrist has the book, about the master and his emissary. Have you heard of Ian McGilchrist? He has the book The Master and His Emissary, which is how the West became kind of overly left hemisphere dominated in its way of thinking and categorizing and understanding knowledge,
Yeah.
and how it needed, and the master was the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere was the right brain's emissary, and there needed to be a kind of balance in the force, so to speak. I'm doing, he used
Yeah.
very good, rigorous evidence, but there needed to be a balance in reintegrating right hemisphere ways of thinking back in with the left brain, so that we're not so specialist knowledge oriented in the West, so that
Yeah.
these disciplines can interact together in a way that's free flowing and rigorous, but off allowing dialogues to happen that would be considered to be passe, just because, well, mimetic prestige is kind of built into different disciplines that say don't touch this, stay in your lane, because
Yeah.
that's the way in which you succeed academically, is you stay in your lane and you drill down. As Thomas Kuhn said, most scientists are not looking to look at the foundational concept and say, I will explore whether this is truly valid that we have quantum physics. No, you stick with the frame and you go and find a niche and you build out onto that. And you don't have any paradigm shifts until you have enough anomalies pile up in a current scientific paradigm that kind of creates a revolutionary overthrow, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I think the corruption of money, when it's centralized in its allocation of resources to different disciplines, can kind of retard that scientific paradigm shift. It can kind of slow that down, right?
Yeah.
Because now you have other questions to be considering rather than the pure desire for scientific truth.
Yeah. And you're also talking about the phenomenon of dichotomies and how mimesis plays into these polarizations of self and other, and sides of east and west, that we know, we kind of, have a much better idea that there's truth on both sides, and they have to somehow be integrated, like you said, to be balanced
Right.
within ourselves personally, but also culturally and politically and so forth. So
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That's something that I think those who are informed by mimetic theory should be leading the charge in terms of being able to facilitate dialogue between left and right divisions, because they're ultimately dealing with uh, half truths that can be reconciled if
mhm,
if there's a humility
mhm,
that both sides can come to terms with and say, okay, look, this person that you hate
yeah,
because of X, Y, and Z, like try to put your feet in their shoes and
yeah,
understand what they're really getting at. And then the same for the other one. And
yeah.
when you do that, if you have the humility to it, you can actually come up with amazing, astounding insights about how close you are on a lot of things.
And James Allison, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, his book, The Joy of Being Wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
It's such a beautiful phrase because it's so true. There is a way in which being wrong, realizing you're wrong, can be
I have it
one of
right here. The joy of being wrong. I feel like reading Rainbow for mimetic theory fans today.
the
Yeah, I got the joy of being
but
wrong.
but sometimes it is hard to compete with the joy of being right, though.
Yeah,
That
yeah, that's
feels
true.
good. Yeah.
Um, Yeah, I mean, because one of the things that Girard talks about is how, and Jean Michel Orgolian, he talks a little bit about it, is this idea that when you desire the other in a rivalrous way, oftentimes it's a desire to be the other, and in some sense, consume the other,
Mhm.
to take over one's, as if the other is a god, right? As if the other is the fount of infinite being that you lack because, you're you and they're them,
Yeah. And you don't realize that that being that they have that you want to consume exists because of you.
Mm,
You're playing into something, you're creating that thing. You are a part of creating what you imagine they are, because they're feeding off of you.
right,
We don't seem to often realize that there's you know we're separating out the all. That's the dichotomy. That person must be all good and I'm all lacking, versus, well, they're built up in a way because I'm feeding. They're drawing something from me, my desire, so they can't be who they are without me.
right.
So it's,
That goes back to what Jesus says when he says the Eucharist, eat my body, drink my blood, right? So to eat me rather than eat each other in a rivalrous way, right? If you need to have someone to devour one's being, devour my being, and there's a positive and a negative aspect to that. I think it means not only emulate and want to be like, but also I think he's inviting those to say, hey, look, if you want to take it out on somebody, take it out on me, not on each other. I'd rather you crucify me than crucify one another, right? Which is the idea of like taking up your cross. It
mm-hmm.
involves like letting go of your feeling of needing to preemptively crucify somebody else before they crucify you, right? To take up the cross, the fear. I put it this way: that instead of sacrificing an other,
Yeah.
self-sacrifice your fear for the other,
Mm-hmm.
and that allows you to kind of bear the responsible position of ending any kind of negative reciprocity that is continually happening, right?
Yeah, and somewhere in there is the need to shift from like a scarcity model to a model of a nonlinear model of there's far more than enough to go around.
Mm.
We kind of
Mm-hmm.
know that, right? That
Mm-hmm.
there's, but it's a matter of access. Like just at the level of food, there's more than enough food in the world to feed everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But how we access that or distributed it. So Jesus is opening himself up, is a different model than the model of collect everything you can for yourself, and that's
Mm-hmm.
how we're going to get enough, versus no, I have more than enough to offer all of you. And
Right.
if the same, then we'll find out, the loaves and fishes become able to feed the 5,000 kind of thing.
Yeah, and that would indicate that he's helping us overcome our death anxiety, which drives a lot of that scarcity mindset, right? Is that they're all ultimately we I was just looking at Jesus's words today in Luke talking about don't, when you lend money, don't expect it to come back to you. That's what those who are not following God do. That I mean, the least you could do is just lend it and don't expect anything in return. And I thought how far away our economy is designed from that. I mean, literally if you're not getting an interest payment, you're losing money because we have such an inflationary system. Your money's losing value if it's not working to multiply itself or something. And
Yeah.
so you think about how wicked and how deeply antichrist our system is, that it creates inherently this kind of way of being that wasn't even we talk about the late 1800s as the era of the Gilded Age, but you could still put your money in the bank and it would actually gain in value. So you didn't have to be speculating and playing interest games with your neighbor to be able to have a retirement. And yet
Yeah.
we're far from that. And in terms of our kind of degenerated moral system of our economy, and yet God still expects us uh, to operate from that post scarcity mindset if we don't fear death, right? We've gotten over that.
I think about that a lot. It is such a powerful thing. What what are we willing to give up to save ourselves?
Mhm.
It's I guess it's sort of, I mean, one example, the housing crisis, and I live in Los Angeles, and like you were saying, a lot of people's retirements might be dependent on their home value going up and up and up, which puts them at odds for allowing for low income housing to be built next door.
Mhm.
So my retirement, so to speak, how much of that am I willing to give up in order to allow others to my property value to go down so that others can have a home?
Mhm. Mhm.
You're right. Um, it's very antichrist, I guess, as you would say.
Yeah. I would say we have an economy that is infinite in its money, but limited in its actual resources of what people are allowed to get with that infinite money. We need to change it to have limited money and abundant resources. So changing the mindset instead of creating debt for everything,
Mhm.
that creates a spirit of a win lose scenario, zero sum mentality where people feel the need to kind of have a
Mhm.
crab in a bucket mindset of, well, if order for me to get ahead, I've got to one up my neighbor as a kind of competitor in this dog eat dog system. That's not at all what you have to really do. But people feel the need, as long as everybody else is doing it, I've got to do it too, or else I'm going to get mowed over by the incentives of our system to be, profit driven first, human second. And that, I don't know. I don't think that we have to live by that spirit. I really don't.
I agree, but knowing that and living that out, yeah, can be two different things.
Well, I really appreciate your time. I think we've covered a lot of kind of uh,
Mhm.
uh, a lot of ideas, a lot of kind of throwing ideas out in a free form fashion. And I do want people to check out your book because it was very inspiring for me uh, to look at. I bought it years ago, Mimesis and Science. Um, but I think it's something that folks need to think about more about how to use, empirical research uh, to develop mimetic theory further. Is there other things that come to mind? And I look at some of the chapters of what you worked on with different scholars. Is there other areas that people might be interested in thinking about how uh, scientific research can help inform people's interest in mimetic theory?
Um, Probably nothing's coming to mind. I will say about that book that it was published in 2011. So a lot of time has passed, and I'm sure there's a lot more research on human imitation, but there's still so much that has not been integrated and collaborated between the sciences and the Girardians. So even though there's probably a lot more research that's come out, I think in that book is still the sort of foundation for, if someone were to read it, realizing the significance, the potential that's there to know both fields and so much more that could come out of them. Yeah.
Well, I'm hopeful that maybe this program and others like it can hopefully be a catalyst for further interdisciplinary dialogues. And I want to continue to develop some of the ideas that I believe are resonant between the physics research that we've done on this program
Mhm.
and mimetic theory. Because,
Yeah.
again, not to make one size fit, there's a mechanistic explanation for everything, but I actually think, you said it helps, having a physics and looking at magnetism brings in mystery. But at the
Yeah.
same time, it's paradoxical because I think at the same time it opens up the opportunity for mystery to be dispelled.
Yeah.
Because, for example, let me put it this way. Okay, if we have a fit, if we our view of human beings is that they're islands, right? Kind of basically. And we have that mimetic theory rightfully critiques that. But our physics also kind of supports the idea that human beings and their relationships are kind of islands, right? But if it's
Mhm.
the case that we're not, right? If it's the case that our heart and our brains and our minds and our whole bodies have magnetic fields that kind of correspond to what we call mimetic attraction and repulsion, then that
Mhm.
opens up a whole opportunity
Mhm.
for understanding between human beings when further knowledge can develop. Oh, so it's not you doing that to me. There's a kind of physical phenomenon that we're experiencing. And, the idea of talk about a human heart has a magnetic field, and that we just read that from that website. I read it, and it talks about, it extends 3 feet away from the person. And you
Mm.
think about how many people may feel, oh, you're making me feel afraid, and the person's not even trying to, but their
Mm.
magnetic field of their heart or whatever is in a state of stress or anxiety or fear, and that other person maybe has a smaller heart or a smaller magnetic field. I'm just guessing here, and it makes you feel overwhelmed or smothered or as if you're being controlled or manipulated. And
Yeah.
so you see how bringing these interdisciplinary works can help resolve a lot of potential relationship problems that people have that they don't have an explanation for because the fields of knowledge have not been able to mature.
Yeah. Well, now you're making me think of if that's a 3 feet from yourself, the magnetic field. Now you're making me wonder what has happened to us in the last several years because of social distancing,
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah,
right? That the lack of contact with each other.
that's a
I think
great point. Yeah.
that's
The
something.
isolation, the despair, the uptick in mental illnesses. I'm sure that you've seen the evidence in your field for people reporting
Yeah,
higher rates of despair in the last few years. Yeah.
you could say, yeah, the lack of contact, even magnetic contact with each other's hearts.
Yeah.
Well, we probably
Absolutely.
won't know the full effects of the last several years for a long time.
Yeah.
Um,
And the thoughts that we have, if they have their own vibrational frequency, and you're in a state of jubilee, I mean, you can make that contagiously felt in the room. If you're in a state of fear because you might be losing your job, you got a bad notice from your doctor, all those things, right, end up becoming mystery because we're afraid to let our science fields talk. And that's kind of the point why I brought you on, is because I think you've spearheaded something that we need like 5 more of these to further, we need to keep working on this. And
yeah.
I hope that this discussion maybe will circulate within them, because a lot of people study mimetic theory, listen to this, watch this program. And I hope that this is a clarion call for folks um, to reach out and talk and interact and let physicists talk to psychologists and let folks who study neuroscience talk to folks who study conflict resolution, and all these things need to be continuing.
Yeah.
Now more than ever we need 20 more we
Yeah.
need 20 more volumes of this every year, a new one. Not that you have to be the guy to do it, but
Well, I
people
was
can
going to
imitate
say,
you.
I appreciate you reaching out to me and pulling me back into a lot of these thoughts that I haven't thought about for a while. It makes me want to go back into it more myself. There's a lot more there.
Well, very good, we'll leave it there. And any other final thoughts, or anywhere that people can find you, or anything else you'd like to share?
Oh boy. I'm sure if, no, I mean, I've mentioned to you, I've written some other, uh, my where my thinking has been going is integrating some of the science and the Girardian ideas into psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, and written an article a couple of years ago in Contagion on that. But but for the most part, I haven't been writing much, and that's why I appreciate, again, you reaching out to me. It gets my juices going and makes me want to contribute more in that way too, to balance things out.
Well, we will follow your work with interest and look forward to hearing more from you shortly. And again, I think this is the beginning of, or the continuation of, a lot of work that needs to be done, because, I think universities typically are not set up to be allowing, oh, hey, let's get the physics professor in with the psychologist or whatever. I mean, but let's do it. We have, with technology, it allows us to do these things, and not be limited by our traditional um, frameworks.
Interestingly enough, I know we're trying to end here, but I just found that this book was referenced a number of different times in a number of articles on shamanism and the
Mhm.
use of psychedelics and the history of shamanism. And I can send you those links too. But I found
Sure.
that interesting.
Yeah.
Just it's fun to find out how this work has been picked up and used by different people in different areas that yeah, obviously have gone beyond what I could imagine it would do. So
Very good. Let's
yeah,
continue that work forward. So thank you again, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Take care, David.
Take care.